Okay, well, let's get started. I would like to welcome everyone to the Center for Faith and Work Los Angeles, a Faithful Presence webinar series. My name is Steve Lindsay, and I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Faith and Work LA. And we had a conference planned back a couple of months ago when all kinds of things started to happening in our city and nation that redirected our plans, and the Lord's been faithful, and we redesigned our conference into a webinar series that we're delighted to bring to you today virtually. So we have a much bigger reach than we typically have with a lot of our local events. So we're happy to offer that to all of you, and we think that this discussion of faith and work is as relevant as ever in the changing times and pressures and dynamics that we're experiencing in our work, no matter our station in life. So first off, I would like to thank our sponsors who have made this possible. We have a whole host of organizations that support us in many different ways. Our primary sponsors for this series in making it possible includes Thrivent Financial. They're a Christian member-owned organization that offers financial services, insurance, investment options, and guidance on how to live generously, which is especially important when you're thinking about stewarding your finances. They're a great group. We're happy to have them. Marketplace Chaplains is also sponsoring us. They provide very personalized and proactive employee care service. So they're a great complement to HR for businesses and have chaplain care teams that meet a whole range of needs that would otherwise not get touched. We also have Made to Flourish. That's a network of pastors who are seeking to encourage and resource each other in faith, work, and economic wisdom for flourishing of our churches and communities. We also have Fusion Leaders. They connect Christians to among marketplace professionals to encourage spiritual growth and business success. They're a great group. I'm a member of the local chapter and really appreciate all that they do as well. We'd also like to just quickly let you know about the Framework Fellows program that we're in open enrollment for right now. Anyone that is interested in this topic of faith and work integration and would like to engage at a deeper level, this is a very dynamic 9-month, much more in-depth vocational discipleship program. We would love to engage with you about that. You can go to our website at faithandworkla.com and click on Framework Fellows. I'll give you a lot of information, and then we have open applications right now. So by all means, check that out as well. And with that, I would like to kind of kick off the first event that we have. We're all experiencing the stress and changes with work right now and rethinking through the role of work and our place in it and how to engage, whether that's with loss of work, overwork, dramatic shift in how we work for many of us. We're delighted to kick off this series with a presentation really focusing in on the value and sense of God's direction and purpose in our work, whatever work we engage in. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to be posting questions along the way. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And we're just thrilled to have Dr. Scott Rae join us today. He's currently Dean of Faculty at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. He has extensive education and expertise in economics, theology, and particularly bio and business ethics. Scott's authored several books. I've enjoyed getting to know him over the years and especially appreciated his book, Business for the Common Good. I've gone back and referenced that work on many occasions. We use it in some of our curriculum. So we are honored to have Scott joining us today. I'll turn it over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Steve, and good. I guess I can officially say good afternoon to all of you. So grateful to all of you for joining in on this conversation. Regardless of where you are, I really like the idea that we can use this technological format to increase the reach of events like this. So, Steve, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to spend some time with a whole bunch of good folks here who want to think a little bit harder about the intersection of their Christian faith and their work. I'm finding it's a very interesting time to talk about our work because we've got more people unemployed than we have since the Great Depression, and more people unemployed more quickly than at any time in our history. Lots of questions about which jobs are going to come back, and how we work has changed. I've been to my Biola University office twice since March 15th for a grand total of about 45 minutes on both those visits. I have enjoyed working from home. The adjustment has gone pretty well, but I miss those conversations down the hallway. I miss the sense of community that we have, that many of us have in our workplaces. And those, we have lots of people who are maybe not unemployed, but underemployed at this time. And for people who are unemployed or underemployed, it's like the whole question of, well, is my work more than just a paycheck? Their response is often, well, what's actually to talk about? Because I don't really care about the answer. I'm happy to have a job. I'm happy to have a paycheck. Sort of end of story. And we've got lots of folks who are retired. At least they're retired from getting a paycheck. We've got people who work as volunteers. We've got people who work as stay-at-home parents in a variety of roles. And then I think, I have special compassion for a group of people that I was exposed to over this past weekend, that I found of all the things that went on in our city and other cities around the world with the protests over the tragedy that happened to George Floyd. It's those who lost their businesses, particularly after barely hanging on for 10 weeks of lockdown. They open up, and then to see them being victimized by a very small group of people who engaged in looting and destruction of property. And I know people who have small businesses that they're just barely hanging on, and the hope is that their business can come back. But that's I think a particularly heartbreaking part of the stuff that went on in our city over the weekend. So I want to look at our work both as compensation, but not just compensation. We tend to reduce it to that much too quickly. And I want to view our work as both compensation and contribution. And I actually think it's a really good time to rethink what our work is about, to reframe our work within a distinctly Christian view of the world. And I think the question, is our work more than just a paycheck, is a totally valid question that we need to constantly be asking, because study after study after study shows that most people in the workplace want some sense of contribution and not just a paycheck out of the work. They want this sense that their work matters, and their work is going to make a difference to somebody or to some organization, some group that's bigger than themselves. So I want us to go back and help us in the next few minutes to reframe the notion of our work theologically. So, I've got a kind of an interesting role at Talbot Seminary and Biola University, because I teach ethics in our business school at Biola University, and I also teach courses at the seminary level. So I am around the next generation of men and women who are going to be headed into the marketplace. And for those of you who have small businesses or are hiring people, I got really good news for you, because I'm very encouraged about the next generation of men and women who are going to be entering the marketplace. They have a solid work ethic. They're serious about their integrity. They take their work really seriously as a sense of calling. And I think they're going to be terrific men and women who are going to be populating our marketplaces. But I also have an opportunity to be around the next generation of pastors and church leaders. And so it's a very interesting set of groups that I get to be around. And I often ask both groups a series of questions. So listen, there we go. And one of the questions I ask is, if you took a poll of people who were in the workplace, and I asked this both of my seminary students, for the men and women in their churches that they serve who are in the workplace, how do you think these men and women would understand their work in relation to their spiritual life? And among both my business students and my seminary students, not to mention a lot of men and women in my church who are in the marketplace, I don't think I get a question that has more of a deer in the headlights look than that one. What that tells me is that most of my business students have not thought about the intersection of their Christian faith and what they're going to spend most of their waking hours and the rest of their lives doing in the workplace. It also tells me that my seminary students have not thought about this at all, which then further suggests that the men and women who they serve in their churches are not getting exposed to any kind of theological framework or any kind of framing of their work that's informed by a distinctly Christian worldview. So I found I need to sharpen the questions a bit to both my business students and my seminary students. So hit the next one, Melissa, if you would. And that is, and this is particular for my seminary students, how do you think that people in the workplace are perceived in our churches? Now, what I'm particularly interested in is for the business students and the men and women in the marketplace, I'm interested in how they perceive themselves vis-a-vis pastors and missionaries and those who draw paychecks from churches or other Christian organizations. How do they perceive themselves vis-a-vis those groups in terms of importance of their work to God's kingdom? And I'm very interested among my seminary students to ask them, how does your church perceive men and women who are in the workplace, again, vis-a-vis pastors, missionaries, those that work for Christian organizations? I get some really interesting answers to that. The next slide, Melissa, if you would. One is, and this, I think, the best example of this I get is from my own father, who is a very savvy business person. He illustrates this first point on the slide, and that is, he only saw the value of his work in this way. He said, look, churches collect revenue, they don't generate it. And so somebody's got to be out there generating revenue for, in his view, the things that really mattered most to God's kingdom, which were the things that took place in the life of the local church. I have a student of mine who told me some years ago, she said, yeah, my business people in my church are viewed as pockets to be picked. And I just cringed when I heard that, thinking, oh, please tell me that's not widespread, because surely we can do better than that. And not long ago, I was in another part of the world where I heard that basically the same thing. Pastoral staff of a church in another part of the world told us about a very distinguished retired business person who they referred to lovingly and affectionately as the, quote, distinguished ATM. And I thought, wow, that's even though it's done so charitably, the view of that distinguished business person is not any better. So one of the ways that I think people see themselves in how they perceived is a source of funding for church ministry. Second, business people see themselves as a source of administrative types of savvy for the local church. I find among pastors and business people that gets mixed reviews, because sometimes both pastors and business people don't quite understand that churches and businesses, though they have a lot of overlap in terms of financial stewardship, are two fundamentally different types of outfits. And then my business students particularly tell me one of the things they're most looking forward to about being in the marketplace is the opportunity to forge relationships with people who are unlikely to ever darken the doors of our churches. I call this the strategic soapbox for living out your faith, and if the Lord gives opportunity, for actually presenting it and sharing it with someone. And I think it's true that there are there are men and women who will never darken the doors of our churches, and the people who represent the Lord Jesus Christ in their various workplaces may be the only open Bible that they ever read, ever see. In fact, I get a big kick out of men and women who lament to me that they are the only Christian in their particular marketplace. And I look at them sort of wide-eyed and I conclude, you mean to tell me that God's entrusted that entire organization just to you? It's unbelievable, but that's true. But I also get some answers that I find really discouraging to that question. One is that people in the workplace, the marketplace, don't view themselves as being on the front lines of what God's doing in the world. I was speaking at a well-known Christian campground some years ago, and I was listening to an evening speaker that had come in just to give some messages to the families that were there. And he was talking about a relationship he had with a prominent business person in his community. And quoting the business person, he put it like this. He said, "Pastor, you're on the front lines, and I'm the supply line." And I think if my wife hadn't been with me, I would have gotten up and said, hold on, that's not quite accurate theologically, because that presents a backward view of what our churches are, because our churches are actually the combinations of boot camps and mass units. And the front lines is actually what happens after we leave the church building, not what takes place inside of it. In fact, I think to view what goes on inside our church buildings as the front lines of what God's doing in the world is sort of tantamount to the soldier who goes to boot camp and says, I think I'll stay here because that's where all the action is. Here's another example of this, of not great answer to this question of how marketplace people are perceived in our churches. We have a lot of my seminary students they have what are called bivocational pastorates. That is, they work in the marketplace for most of Monday through Friday, and they pastor a church in what little free time they have left. And I have yet to hear one person who considers themselves a bivocational pastor have any value of what they do in the workplace other than providing a paycheck so they can do what they think really matters to God most in the pastorate. And I think both of those views, I think, reflect a theology of work and vocation that's not so much incorrect as it is incomplete. Now, some of you may be familiar with the halftime notion. This is the book that's been popular for many years, and it basically argues that once you reach the halftime of your life, when you've kind of been there, done that in the workplace, and your kids are grown and raised and up and out, you get to halftime of your life, you can reassess your gifts and talents and skills and your sense of calling. And you can move, as the author suggests, from success to significance. And in the second half of your life, be about kingdom work. Well, I want to ask the person, well, what did you think you were doing in the first half of your life? Why don't you think you were doing kingdom work in the first half of your life when you were at work in the marketplace? Now, I found, too, that in some of my seminary students, for example, they come from cultures where this dichotomy between the pastorate and the workplace is even more pronounced. And there are, I think, a number of reasons for that we don't have time to go into for now. But what I've learned from both my business students, my seminary students, and from the interactions I've had with men and women who make their living in the marketplace is that I think it's fairly widespread. And if you're an exception to this, I really want to hear about it. But I think it's fairly widespread that folks in the marketplace and in the business community feel like they are somehow doing something less than for God's kingdom compared to men and women who draw their paychecks from churches, mission organizations, nonprofits, or some other type of Christian organization. And I want to challenge that idea theologically here in the next few minutes together. Because I think we can all acknowledge that our work has instrumental value, in that it accomplishes a lot of other things. But what I want to suggest is that what the Bible teaches is that our work also has intrinsic value in and of itself. It's an intrinsically good thing that we are working. and working in the jobs that we are in. So let me go back. If I could, to give you just a really quick survey of the big story of the Bible and how it contributes to our understanding of our work and vocation, because I think it's really important. There are 4 primary chapters in the big story of the Bible: creation, the fall, redemption, and consummation. Okay, those refer to redemption and consummation refer to both the first coming and the second coming of Christ. So creation, another way to put that would be creation reflects the way things ought to be. The fall reflects the way things are in our sin-filled, broken world, okay, which we got a good look at over the weekend. Redemption reflects the way things could be as a result of the inauguration of the kingdom of God with the first coming of Christ. And then the consummation of all of this reflects the way things will be when the Lord Jesus returns and brings in his kingdom in its fullness. Now, I don't know about you, but in my theological background, I got these middle 2 chapters 2 and 3, really well. And I got sin and redemption down great. Well, what I missed were the bookends. And the bookends are what tell us that our salvation is not just for our own benefit, but for the life of the world. And so both bookends of creation and consummation, at the initial creation and at the new creation, when the Lord returns and brings his kingdom in its fullness, work plays a fairly predominant role. Let's look first at creation as we outline our theology of work. I often ask folks who are making a living in the marketplace, tell me which part of the Bible did God ordain work? In Genesis 1 and 2 or in Genesis 3? Now, my seminary students normally get this right in a mixed group. It's about half and half. But the Bible's very clear that God ordained work before the general entrance of sin into the world. God ordained Adam and Eve to work in paradise as part of the dominion mandate for all human beings, regardless of their worldview. Now, here's, I think, the catch on this that I think is one of the big takeaways, for me at least, from this material, is that in Genesis 1, when God commands Adam and Eve, he has just created Adam and Eve in his image, and he commands them with 5 different commands. He said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over it. Right? Now, I want to make sure we get this right, because the notion of fruitful, there we often connect with that second command to be fruitful and multiply, referring to procreation. But in reality, they're intended to be separate. And the be fruitful actually has nothing to do with procreation. It has everything to do with vocation, occupation, and economics. The command there is to be vocationally, occupationally, economically fruitful, unlocking what God has embedded into his created order. It's a vocation, an economic emphasis. Now, at the other bookend of biblical history, I hate to break this to you, but when the Lord comes and brings his kingdom in its fullness, we will still be working. The Bible is very clear that the prophets, for example, talk about when the kingdom comes in its fullness, we will beat our swords into what? Plowshares. Our spears into pruning hooks. That is, the implements of war will be no more, because they will be transformed into the implements of productive work, which suggests to me we will still be working when the Lord comes and brings his kingdom in its fullness. Now, some of you, I suspect, are giving me a dirty look at this point. I'm not so sure about the getting a paycheck part, but I suspect we will still have trade and exchange and a medium of exchange. It's just the workplace will be free from sin and corruption. Now, finally, in Genesis 1, work matters because of who God is. God comes right out of the chute in Genesis 1, working, exercising entrepreneurial traits. He rests from his work throughout the Old Testament. He is at work, upholding and sustaining his creation. Our work is significant because ultimately it's a part of who God is and a part of what it means to be made in his image. This is what I think the late Chuck Colson meant. You can hit the slide. when he said we are hardwired for work. It's part of our spiritual DNA. Now, I need to say also we're hardwired for Sabbath and for rest as well. God did not hardwire us to be workaholics, but we are wired for work. The British novelist Dorothy Sayers put it like this. She said, work is not what one does to live, but the thing one lives to do, the medium in which one offers himself or herself to God. This is why the Bible can say in Ecclesiastes, for example, at the next slide, if you would. They can put it like this, that a person can do nothing better. You hear that? Nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment? And then in chapter 3, 12 and 13, same thing. I know there's nothing better than for people than to be happy and do good while they live, that each may eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil or their work. This is the gift of God. In the New Testament, this is equally clear. And Paul describes this in Colossians 3, where our work is an arena of service to Christ. He said, whatever you do, which that's a pretty big tent, right? Work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you'll receive inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Now, right there in the text, the biblical text, you should put in parentheses, in whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. Now, that text, go back one just a little. That text, if you look back to Colossians 3:22, was written to slaves, household servants in the first century, who did arguably the most mind-numbing, meaningless grunt work that you can imagine in the first century. But the Apostle Paul there affirms that even the work of household servants is an arena of service to Christ, since it's done for him ultimately, and it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving in the very work that you are doing. Now, I often ask it right at this point to make sure we get this right. This is another really important takeaway from this, because I will often ask workplace men and women, I will say, tell me about your ministry in the workplace. And what kind of answer do you think they give me? I get lots of very interesting answers to this. They tell me things like, I pray for my coworkers. If I have a chance to share my faith with my coworkers, I do that. We have a Bible study in our office or after work. If my coworker is going through a difficult time in their lives, I'll pray for them or offer compassion or offer to be of service to them. And it's about this time I point out to them that all the things you're describing as your ministry are the things that you are doing when you are not doing your job. Hardly anybody equates their ministry, their service to God in the workplace with the actual work that they are doing. And regardless of whether you have found your niche in terms of your skills and talents, or you're underemployed, or in a place where you're not in a great fit, still the very work you do matters to God because it's a form of your service to Him. Now go in Acts chapter 6, we get this idea, I think, a little bit more clearly. For the idea of your work as your ministry. And I think the term for ministry there, the Greek term diakonia, is more commonly rendered service. I think we have a little easier time wrapping our arms around this concept if we use the service translation of that. But for example, in Acts chapter 6, look at the two ways in which the term diakonia is used here. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic or the Greek-speaking Jews among them complained against the Hebraic or the Aramaic-speaking Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily ministry, literally, the daily diakonia of food. Okay? In other words, they were starving to death. So the 12, the apostles, gathered all the disciples together and said it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry, diakonia, of the Word of God in order to wait on tables and serve these widows. Now, but what I want you to see here is that the work involved in the daily distribution of food so that these widows could survive, and the work of the Word of God are both described using the same term, diakonia, both described as service to God, both referred to as ministry in that sense. So here's what I want to suggest as a way to think about this. Hit the next slide, if you would, Melissa. Is that all of us, if we are a believer in Christ, are in full-time ministry or full-time service. Okay? What I mean by that, it's not just pastors and missionaries that are in full-time ministry, because every follower of Jesus is in full-time service to the King. And you entered full-time service not at the time where you decided where a paycheck was coming from, but you entered full-time service at the moment that you came to faith in Christ. And nobody leaves full-time service by virtue of changing jobs. You simply change arenas of service. You change arenas of full-time service. Even dying does not get you out of full-time ministry, because you just enter an eternal arena of service. In fact, the only time I'm aware of that somebody leaves full-time service to Christ is when they defect from their faith. So that if I have somebody who tell me they're leaving their ministry, I look at them like wide-eyed and say, tell me you haven't given up your faith. Because that's really the only way you leave full-time service. Now, the other thing I want to affirm is that the workplace, simply by virtue of the number of hours we spend there, my guess is that the average person who attends our churches spends an average of 10 times more time in the workplace than he or she does in the church building. The workplace is the best opportunity for you to love your neighbor. It's the best opportunity for you to engage in service to Christ. It's the best opportunity for you to use your spiritual gifts, to use the gifts and skills and talents that God has given you. It's the best opportunity for you to seek the common good of your community. It's also the primary place for your spiritual formation. Now, that's not to downplay what goes on inside the church building, but what that does suggest is that simply by virtue of the number of hours we spend in the workplace, wouldn't it stand to reason that the interactions we have in the workplace are going to be the primary place in which the Spirit of God chips away at the rough edges of our character, and is the place where God is perhaps most involved, shaping us and molding us. And I think for those of you who are in church leadership, for example, I think one of the primary occupations of our churches is to help our men and women who are in the marketplace have their antenna up so that they can actually perceive the things that God is doing in their lives in the workplace to shape them spiritually. Yet I have a hunch that most of those go right over our heads because our antennas simply are not up for that. Now, let me suggest a couple of other things. One is to ensure that our language matches our theology. And that is, I would get rid of the term full-time ministry. We've already talked about that a bit. What troubles me is when pastors and missionaries use the term full-time ministry to describe their work. The business person comes into the local church and hears that as though he or she is in part-time or no-time ministry, neither of which is true theologically. I've also encouraged both my seminary students and business students to stop talking about secular jobs. Because if it's true that this is my Father's world, there's no such thing as a secular job. In fact, I get a big kick out of people who lament the fact that not only are they the only believer in their job, but they often ask the question, can you tell me how to bring God into my workplace? I've got news for you. God's already there. He's well ahead of you. And thank God for that he is. Because what I want to be really careful about is that we don't recreate this sacred secular dichotomy that the reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin gave their lives to obliterate. And we, I think, have recreated that in a sense that something that's sacred is something that God really cares about, and something that's secular is something that not so much. But there's no such thing as a secular job, because all All of creation is under the lordship of Christ. And there's not a square inch, as Abraham Kuyper put it, not a square inch of creation that Jesus does not cry out, mine. And if it's true that this is my Father's world, then there's no such thing as an entirely secular job. So I think the key point here is that your ministry, your service in the workplace includes, and I think not only includes, but the main part of it is the very work that you do. So we tell our business students accounting is ministry. Auditing someone's books is full-time ministry. Marketing is ministry. Advertising is ministry. Sales is ministry. My kids are all in the arts. My oldest son's a filmmaker. Filmmaking is ministry. My middle son's an audio engineer. Audio engineering in the music business is ministry. My youngest son is pursuing acting and working in the restaurant business in the meantime. Both of those areas, acting is ministry. Restaurant work is ministry. It's full-time service for the person who is a follower of Jesus. And that really is what we mean by a vocation. There's a lot of confusion about that term, it seems to me. But a vocation is simply an arena of service that you are called to. And most of us have multiple vocations to which we are called to simultaneously. I mean, I have a vocation as a husband and as a dad and as a professor, as a church member, as a neighbor. I actually think I have a vocation to another part of the world. I think mine happens to be in Australia. I've been there to serve the Lord on several different occasions. And so that's what we mean by a vocation. Our work is one arena of service. It's one part of our vocation, but not the whole of it. So let me go back, Melissa, one slide here, and then we'll wrap this up. Let me illustrate this with a very dear friend of mine, who I think got this just right. He and his wife were coming back from a European vacation several years ago. And on the jetway coming off of the airplane when they arrived back in Los Angeles, his wife collapsed on the jetway and unconscious, breathing, but otherwise unconscious. They obviously rushed her to the ER, called in a neurosurgeon. MRI showed that she had a small tumor about the size of a quarter at the base of her brain that had caused her blackout. And through outpatient neurosurgery, which I previously thought was an oxymoron, but apparently it's not, outpatient neurosurgery using a gamma knife technology, the surgeon excised the tumor and with minimal collateral damage to the rest of the brain. And she went home that day, and to my knowledge is fine today. Now, my friend, in reflecting on all the stuff that happened with his wife and all the occupations that had to come together to facilitate his wife's healing, he was particularly taken with the imaging software that enabled the surgeon to pinpoint exactly where the tumor was and to minimize that collateral damage to the rest of the brain. You know what he said? He said, assuming this person's a follower of Christ, he said, I am so glad that the person who wrote that imaging software didn't decide to leave their business to go serve the Lord full time. I'm so glad he didn't decide to leave his or her business to go serve the Lord full time, because they were already there in full-time service. And I think he got this exactly right. And that God calls us to the workplace in the same way that he calls men and women to the pastorate, to the mission field. And where you get a paycheck, there is no necessary connection between where you get a paycheck and your level of spiritual commitment, spiritual maturity. Because I have found in my experience, the most spiritually mature men and women are the ones, with the exception of my hero, the late Dallas Willard, who was the most Christ-like person I've ever been around. But the most spiritually mature people I know are the men and women who are navigating the ethical tensions, the dilemmas with their faith in the marketplace day in and day out, managing them successfully, taking care of the people who work with them and work for them, and who are stewarding the resources that God has given them. So maybe, Steve, maybe this would be a good place to stop for some questions and for some discussion. I really appreciate the chance to share some thoughts theologically about how to frame our work, and would invite your discussion and questions and pushback. And the good thing about a format like this is they can't throw anything at me. So
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Scott, for that. You know, I was just thinking as you're talking about kind of this rich theology of work and background of the beauty of seeing creation in this much larger narrative of Scripture. How wonderful that is, and thinking about the person whose life feels upended right now, and they are a lot of people are very disoriented when it comes to it could be somebody that's used to being in a very dynamic office environment with a lot of schedules and projects and things going on, and all of a sudden they're at home and they got 3 children running around, and they're trying to navigate the sense of how to manage a completely different environment and being half teacher, half parent, half employee and serving their business, and put that into the context of meaningful work.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I have a faculty colleague who's a single mom who's working from home and basically homeschooling her children, who are at various educational levels. And her comment was, "Help! I didn't sign up for this." And so I think what she's had to do is recognize that her work constitutes a lot more than just the thing she's getting a paycheck for. It constitutes what she's doing with her kids, what she's doing to maintain her home, what she's doing to support her neighbors. All of that. While it's being upended, I think the ambiguities that we're dealing with, I think, keep us from viewing our work too narrowly just in terms of that compensation. But we view it in terms of contribution too. And what we are doing to get a paycheck is important, but the things that we are doing as parents, as neighbors, as homeschool educators is just as important to God's kingdom as what we're doing to getting a paycheck from. I remember the way Luther had a very picturesque way of putting this, as he did a lot of things, where he said it's just as holy to change a child's diaper as it is to teach that child a Sunday school lesson. And it is just as holy to educate your children and to feed them and to clothe them as it is to do the work that God has called you to do. And I would say, what's the workplace of the future going to look like 6 months from now? I think that's anybody's guess. I'm not exactly sure that people are going to be rushing back to their offices.
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of like the idea of, putting a sports shirt on and having my pajama bottoms on underneath. And I've been wanting to be able to teach in my pajamas for a long time, and I think I'm about halfway there at the moment. But I think what I would suggest is that, the workplace of the future, I think, is going to be by necessity increasingly nimble, increasingly fast-moving, and increasingly change-oriented. And so I suspect we're in for a white-knuckle ride here that I think may last for a while. And I think the people who are going to do best at this are going to be the ones who are, who have the least invested in doing things the old way and are willing to embrace new ways of doing things. And I think a lot of the new ways we're going to find out are going to turn out to be a lot better.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Let's see, we got some questions rolling in here. Let me read you one of them. One says, in order for us to verbalize the value of our work, are there other ends to promote than just helping people? Do you think all jobs can be said to support that telos in the end?
I think most of them can. I think we need to be, we need to recognize that there are some jobs there are some occupations that I would say are intrinsically evil, and those are just off the table. And I think most occupations, because of the general entrance of sin, are going to be mixed. They're going to provide a lot of benefit, but they're going to have some dark sides to them too. Now, I think for the most part, the legitimate industries and occupations are the ones, those are the ones that are providing goods and services that are needed by our communities, that make our communities better places. Those, I think, are the ones that we can continue to see those as having intrinsic value. But clearly, the Bible is also clear. Our work does have instrumental value. I mean, our work is a jumping off place to accomplish other things. The Bible makes it really clear it's important that we work to support ourselves and our dependents. Like, the Bible's got some pretty strong language for people who don't do that. The Bible's also very clear that we work in order to support the poor. We work to give to the work of the local church. All of that's important. So we work because it accomplishes other things. What I think we miss sometimes, and what the Bible affirms most strongly, is that our work in and of itself has value regardless of the other things that it accomplishes.
Yeah.
So I think we should be prepared for the idea that our work's going to be mixed. That's why we have ethical dilemmas, why we have difficult people. I tell my business students, please, make sure that you're not one of those difficult people that others are lamenting about. And that's why we have, we have some workplaces that are poorly managed. We have some workplaces that are oppressive. All of that's true. That doesn't justify it, but we shouldn't be surprised by that, because the workplace has been infected by sin like every other aspect of creation.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think there's you speak to the strategic thinking of God to place us into some of those environments for the express purpose of putting somebody there that can live into that well and try to push back on the darkness and bring some glimpses of light and kingdom.
Yeah, and not without tension in that.
Right. Absolutely.
And we would encourage people not to leave the environment at the first hint of tension.
Right.
And to as best you can, keep your place at the table, because you lose any opportunity to influence the organization if you're on the outside.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Let's see. Here's a question. Would you please touch on how these ideas can be reflected in our finances, in particular related to financially supporting what people call full-time or long-term missionaries?
Yeah, good. That's a very perceptive question, because it's not just our work that matters to God. It's also the fruit of our labor that matters to God, and what we do with that. And I do think that the Bible calls us to give to the men and women who are devoting themselves to full-time evangelism in other parts of the world. They're devoting themselves to the kind of service where they are not going to get a paycheck from that. And I think there's a place for that. What I want to get away from, though, is somehow thinking that the people who are raising support like that are somehow more, on a different level spiritually than the men and women who are slugging it out in the marketplace. I don't think that's necessarily true, and I think we've had enough. I think we've had enough scandals, both on the mission field and in the pastorate, to disabuse us of any notion that there's a necessary connection between your spirituality and where you get a paycheck from. But I think God calls us, I think, to take a really serious look at what we do with our money. And I think that in investing in businesses, I think can do some of the same things, because our investments are not just for our own self-interest. They create jobs, they create opportunities, they create wealth and products that benefit all of our communities. But ultimately, the reason we're commanded to give is not because the missionaries need it, not because God needs us to give. We give to those things in order to break the power of money in our lives. That's ultimately the reason that we're commanded to give. I mean, God owns the cattle of 1,000 hills. God does not need our giving to promote his kingdom. We need our giving to promote our own sense of spiritual health. And that's ultimately the reason we do that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I want to jump to a question here I think is could be very helpful. What language or prayers could we incorporate into our daily lives in order to move intentionally, more intentionally realize that our work is ministry?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. I would take, for example, I pray regularly the end of the 90th Psalm. In fact, even though I pray it regularly, I'm not sure I have it completely memorized. Let me get it exactly right here. The end of the 90th Psalm says in verse 17, "May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands." Yes, establish the work of our hands. If I were a pastor, I would conclude every Sunday worship service with that benediction. As I send the people out who I'm serving into the workplace, I would pray for them, for God to establish the work of their hands. The other thing I would pray regularly is at the end of Ephesians 2, where I think we often miss this part, which I'm still trying to figure out why that is. In Ephesians 2, this is in the sort of classic verse in verse 9, "For by grace you've been saved through faith. This is not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." We often miss verse 10 in that. "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works." That works there is the same term that's used to describe our work, which God prepared in advance for us to do. And I'd want to pray that I would be faithful to the good works in the workplace that God has prepared beforehand for me to do. And I mean, most people view their good works as the things that they do in their off time. I think the lion's share of the place where we get to do our good works is actually in the workplace. Serving our customers, serving the people who we work with, and so on.
Yeah, that's excellent. There's another good question here, and I'm going to summarize it. It's a little lengthy. He's very inspired by this concept of God infusing the intrinsic value of work as ministry. And he has a concern on how do you keep from getting so intentional and trying to be so focused on developing what you do at work that you lose your sense of dependency on God and how this is all going to play out.
Yeah, great question. That's why I mentioned prior, when I say we're hardwired for work, we're also hardwired for Sabbath. And it's not an accident that God took one day after the 6 days of creation to rest. Not that God needed to rest, but that he needed to model that for us who need to rest. And I think ultimately the reason that God modeled the Sabbath was so that we would recognize that our work, though it has nobility and it's very important, is not the thing that defines us as a person. And we're commanded to take 1 day in 7 to remove all the occupational obstacles out of our lives so that we can focus on our walk with God, to focus on the things that refresh and renew us, and so that we can come back to our work refreshed. In fact, actually, I think the way the ancient Greeks understood this is more on the target, because I think for most of us in the West, we have Sabbath so that we can work more effectively. Right? The ancient Greeks reverse that, because their term for work was the term askolia, which it means the absence of. And it comes from the Greek word skole, which we get our word school, which actually refers to contemplation and reflection and rest. And so for the ancient Greeks, our work was the absence of rest, where the rest was primary and the work was subordinate to that, not the reverse, the way we typically do that in the West. For us, our work is primary and our rest is subordinate to that. I think that's probably bad. I think the ancient Greeks were onto something there, where we view what we do for Sabbath as primary and our work is subordinate to that.
Yeah. Well, that's great. We are coming up on the hour, so I'm going to cut off. I apologize to those questions that are hanging out there, but we are so grateful for you, Scott, joining us today.
My pleasure.
And I just want to offer a couple of quick reminders coming up, things to look forward to. If Melissa, you can pull the screen back up. Yeah, a quick reminder, we have open applications on Framework Fellows. Definitely encourage you, if you're inspired by this concept of seeing your work through a different lens and really living that out. This is a great program opportunity. We'd be happy to share more about it with you. So please check out our website at faithla.com. And our next webinar coming up is going to be in 2 weeks from today. We're having Douglas McKelvey, who is an amazing songwriter, author, speaker, creative, who has thought very deeply and thoughtfully about work and vocation and thinking through. He has a message on rehearsing the new creation through our work. That's absolutely fabulous. So I encourage you to join us, sign up for 2 weeks from now, and there'll also be a short survey as we close it. I think you'll get a notice about. We really would appreciate it if you fill it out. We want to make these webinars as rich and meaningful as possible to each of you. And with that, just want to thank again Scott and all of you for joining us today, and God bless till we see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.